Hey, I'm Lacy Schutz. I'm the director of Shaker Museum in Chatham, New York. I'm delighted that you're all here with us today. On behalf of the Henry Luce Foundation and our hosts at the New York Historical Society, I welcome you to the Conversations on American Art and Museums, a celebration of the Luce American Art Program's 40th anniversary. Since its founding in 1982, the American Art Program has provided support totaling $215 million to 500 museums across all 50 states. It continues to award approximately $7.5 million annually for innovative museum programs in the visual arts. Through this work, Luce seeks to advance the role of visual arts in an open and equitable society and the potential for museums to serve as public forums for art-centered conversations that celebrate creativity, explore difference, and seek common ground. With an eye toward the future and the best possible futures for art museums, these conversations will explore the capacity of art museums to challenge accepted histories and advance the dialogues in which we need to engage with diverse collaborators and communities. I'm joined today by Anna Tobin D'Ambrosio. She was appointed president and CEO of Munson in Utica, New York in August 2017. She served previously as the director of Museum of Art there from 2012. A native of Albany, New York, and D'Ambrosio holds a master's degree from the Cooperstown Graduate Program and received her bachelor's degree from College of the Holy Cross, Worcester, Massachusetts. Hi, Anna. I'm also joined by Andrea Andersson, who serves as founding director and chief curator of Rivers Institute for Contemporary Art and Thought in New Orleans. Previously, she worked as the Helus Foundation Chief Curator of Visual Arts at the Contemporary Arts Center in New Orleans. She has taught at Barnard College and New York University. She is an alumna of Stanford University and Columbia University. Hi.
Hello, glad to be here.
So we're here today to talk about the role that museums and cultural institutions have to play in preserving both tangible and intangible culture in a world that is experiencing increased upheaval and migration, specifically forced migration due to climate change and violence and war. So I would like to just start off by talking a little bit with both of you about the populations that you serve, which I know are very diverse in a lot of ways, but Utica and New Orleans both have populations of people who either in recent generations or past generations have been subject to migrations of various sort, forced and otherwise. So Anna, do you want to start off and talk a little bit about Utica?
Sure. So in the national press, Utica has been called the city that loves refugees. And 1979, a refugee center opened here in Utica. And its goal was to welcome Amerasians and people from former Soviet Union countries. But in more recent years, we have welcomed people ethnically Karen, people from Burma, now Myanmar. They've often spent a decade or more in refugee camps in Thailand. We have Sudanese, Nepali, Somali, and Somali Bantu, Iraqi, more recently, of course, Ukrainian. So really anywhere there has been strife in the world, the Resource Center for Refugees here in the Mohawk Valley has been welcoming people to our community and helping to get them settled. And the city has a history of welcoming immigrants, of course, with Irish, Italian, and Poles in the late 19th and early 20th century. So right now, the Resource Center has welcomed over 17,000 refugees to our city in the last 30 plus years. They make up about 20% of the population, and in our public school system, more than 40 languages are spoke. So that is definitely a stress on the public school system, but the transition in this city due to the waves of refugees that have come through, it really has been transformational. From neighborhoods being rebuilt, a Protestant church being turned into a Bosnian mosque, mom and pop grocery stores with the variety of food that's available, And it has stemmed the turn in what was a loss of population in the city of Utica. So we actually stopped losing population and with the last census gained population, and that was due to welcoming refugees and immigrants.
And Andrea, you talk a little bit about what it's like in New Orleans.
Sure. I mean, it's such a different context. I love to hear Anna describe the kind of context in which she works. So, New Orleans is a city that is perpetually losing people. We will all go eventually. I mean, it's a kind of living knowledge around climate change and the precarity of our landscape. But it's one that's layered onto histories of forced migration. And so the work that I think is happening daily here is a kind of slower change, right? We're not welcoming new communities and populations in the way that Utica is doing, but we have lifetimes of work, frankly, to do in the communities that that shaped this city 200, 300 years ago. I mean, and there are so many ways that gets demonstrated both through our sort of daily cultural customs. And one of the communities that's really present in New Orleans, or one of the cultural customs and traditions that's really present in New Orleans that I think becomes a super signifier of this are the masking Indians, or the Mardi Gras Indians, which is really a kind of it's a part of ritual that is this perfect visual demonstration of the way that kind of cultures get woven together, I think, here, cultures that have had shared fates, right? So it's both, those who of African descent and have with histories of enslavement, connecting with those from the indigenous communities, both forced migrations of different ilk. But I think one of the things that happens in New Orleans is a sort of, the process of assimilation is also weaving in all of these histories. So, we have a pretty sizable Vietnamese community here. And there's this kind of cross fluency or a learning of all the histories before, and all hopefully these sort of acquired or collected tools that we'll use in what will inevitably be a kind of migration away from this region, as we're reminded with a Hurricane 5 that nobody knows where it's going right now in the Atlantic.
Yeah. So one of the things that we spoke about when we were preparing for this panel is just the basic essential question of how do you invite people into a culture that isn't there? And I know that both of you have grappled with programming in your institutions of ways to sort of find sameness and find resonance across different traditions, that though we might approach them differently, we all have traditions of attire or our family relationships. So Anna, do you want to talk a little bit about how you've approached that?
Sure. I think it's important to start with a foundation of staff going out to the communities, rather than when we starting with just a program that we then invite people to join. So we have made an effort to participate, to join community groups, to do tabling events at ethnic festivals in our community, the World Refugee Day, participate in World Refugee Day, but even as simple as going to a community center and sitting down with the group and saying, like, okay, so if we'd like to do this program, but first we want to hear from you, is it even something you're going to be interested in? What time of day would work for you? What age group would be best? And I always tell the story that I was sitting down with some young women who were maybe first or second year college students, and they were Somali. And I said, well, what would you want to eat at a reception? Right? Because we always serve basic stuff. Every museum, it's cheese and crackers. And they were like, do not serve us cheese. That is not welcoming. Cheese is like giving us old, moldy food. So I think you have to start with that basic foundation. And then from there, we have developed a lot of programs that are in conjunction with exhibitions that invite different voices and different interpretations of art. But then also we might do a major exhibition and then a parallel exhibition drawn from the community. so that we can see that cross-fertilization from working, whether it's a traveling exhibition or a permanent collection, and how those commonalities, such as you mentioned, like adornment or ritual or place, and how they are shared, right? It's a universal human expression, right? Art is a universal human expression. So, for example, we did a wonderful kimono exhibition, and in our sculpture court, we invited the refugee community to do an exhibition of ceremonial dress. And, on a Monday morning when we're closed, we had Thai monks dressing a mannequin, and we were serving them tea. And just things that you don't expect that in your museum career that's going to happen, but then it's the perfect confluence of what we're trying to do and reaching out to the community.
Andrea?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's also, I should probably share that Rivers is not a traditional museum exactly, right? We don't have a physical space. We are a kind of a research organ in the broadest sense, a research and project development organ, working with artists and working within the community for art that is of the global diaspora, art and artists whose experiences have been shaped, whose imaginations have been shaped by migration and translation and displacement and also assimilation. And so, when I think about the sort of origins of our model, I always go back to an exhibition that I organized with the artist Cecilia Vicuña, who is Chilean, in 2017. And this was before Rivers was born, but it was held here in the city of New Orleans. It was at the Contemporary Art Center for its first showing. And there is not a sizable Chilean community in New Orleans. So it was an interesting project to evolve because it was less about a kind of representational, finding cultural sameness, that being able to recognize one's own history in Cecilia's, but it became about being able to recognize one's own experience, which is a slightly different thing. And so Cecilia's work contends, in radical ways with indigenous knowledge, with the impacts of climate change, with the petroleum industry, and the kind of degradations to our environment. And all of this was registered across this exhibition. And it was one of the most, for me, homemaking, I'm originally from New Orleans, exhibitions that I had been a part of. And I think that was a real big learning experience for me, that it could be something that isn't about my own cultural experience, but it can be about my lived experience. And that's the kind of structure that we've embedded into Rivers. And so, our program, we welcome artists from around the globe to come for deep research and project development in New Orleans. But we are always kind of looking for artists' work or projects that really rhyme with our own. So, right now in just last week, we had the artist Alia Farid, who is Kuwaiti and Puerto Rican, with us. And she has been working for some time now, many years, filming in the wetlands of Basra in southern Iraq. And when she was here last with us in the spring, we went out into the wetlands of the delta of southeastern Louisiana, and just kind of having these two histories, these two cultural constructions, these two histories of genocide and maroon colonies. I mean, the compounding references are astonishing, and they're also really illuminating for your own. When does something get strange? And I think that's something I go back to a lot, this idea of estrangement, which is, a term that we usually comes out of aesthetics or philosophy. And to make something strange is not, we're usually talking about in terms of making the ordinary strange. So when our own experience gets estranged by that sort of running up against somebody else's experience, I think is really sort of a foundational construction for us is estrangement as a way of looking closely and necessarily opening on to some kind of learning about other people, but also about our own position.
Well, I think this touches on one of the things that we had discussed earlier, which is this tension between representation versus exchange. So, are you representing another culture back at itself, or is it a two-way street? And I think that it's important that we recognize, as you've said, that we're looking both ways when we do this kind of thing. And I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about that, Andrea, about this idea of exchange and traveling down this two-way street.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's funny. I was thinking when the announcement for this talk came out, I was hadn't really paid much attention to what it was called. And of course, we talk a lot about preservation in museum work, right? We're preserving objects habitually. And I think that it's a word that is also impossible. And I think about that all of the time, particularly here.
It looks like Andrea may be frozen.
Okay, well, I was just picking up and was writing down, she talked about to talk about preservation and the preservation of culture and what art museums are doing there. And when you think about what goes on in the world, if you wanted to destroy a culture, you destroy its art, you displace its people, you destroy its architecture. And while we are working with displaced people here in Utica who have lost that culture, have lost their homes, and much of their culture has been destroyed by governments and invading armies. We are trying to help preserve their culture by finding that mutual ground. So it brings me to a story of a Burmese student, young woman who was looking at a Louise Bourgeois spider, and her interpretation of that spider was that it was medicinal. That was when she was in a refugee camp and she was ill, her family ground spiders and herbs for medicinal purposes. And so she saw it as healing. And for us to be able to take that interpretation and incorporate that into our collection, on a very small scale, but preserving those stories does, in some respects, help preserve culture. And when we do parallel exhibitions and interpretations and audio guides with those from our refugee community and wanting to represent their voices to help not just preserve their culture, but to help teach about their culture to other people coming to the museum as well. So I think that the preservation aspect is really an important theme throughout the work that we're doing and that Andrea was expressing. You're back, so.
Yes, forgive me. I can't account for that, but I'm sad that I missed a bit of what you were saying. But I think where I left off was just a kind of question around, or at least a kind of affirmation that we are really cognizant of the fact that the work that we do builds on history. So I think when I got knocked off, I was talking about a partnership that we have with the Amistad Research Center, which is an extraordinary archive here in New Orleans, and so. Really thinking about those relationships between contemporary practice and inviting contemporary artists into the archive and into histories that aren't their own is sort of core in our work. And so in that way, there's the preservation of history because there's a learning about history. But I think that we are sort of acutely aware that we are in perpetual change, even as we're sort of addressing new ways. I mean, it's in the small things, right? I mean, I think even this past week in New York, and new kinds of heat on post Labor Day for everyone who was there, and I think, or is there right currently, and I think, we are all making adjustments, and so, I think as at Rivers, we are also holding a lot of space for, what is our relationship to objecthood as a kind of central endeavor, which is of course a huge part of contemporary art practice. But when I hear you speak, and I keep going back again to the recognition that what you're talking about is what is commonly described as programming around or interpretive work about work, but there's a moment in which that's the work. Yes, there are important objects that we're holding, and that the importance of that form and that shape and that history, and but what you're talking about is really about the conversation that grows out of these encounters.
Right, we're preserving, you're right, where you're saying that becomes a work because we are preserving that now. That new level of interpretation from representatives in our community, audio, video, and incorporating it into everything that we're doing.
Right.
Yeah.
Which is not just a preservation, right? It's also the evolution of all of that, right? Every
Right.
time you have a program, it's the kind of building on that history and understanding of that tradition, which is so exciting. Mhm.
Yeah, I can remember, now probably 2 decades ago when we started this work, but someone saying, well, we're an American art collection. Like, how is this going to be relevant?
Mhm.
And finding that relevance was the easiest part.
Yeah.
Yeah, because it was just making those connections.
Mhm.
May I ask you what's the hardest part? Wait, that felt like
Yeah, that's a good question. The hardest part is sustaining it, is sustaining the programming. We're a relatively small staff here. One of the first big programs we did, was NEA funded. And so sustaining the work and the refugees, many people settle here in our community. As I said, we're also a secondary city for placement. So we get a lot of people who come then to be with their families or extended families or people from their homes. And it's that constant work because people have a lot of pressure on their lives. Like their goals, of course, are to find jobs and to get settled into the community. And once they get busy and have kids who are in school and whatever, it's keeping that going. So some of the things that we've done, have been very practical by developing a program that not only introduces people to Munson as an organization and to the collection, but then teaches a skill. So that we did a program that an exhibition evolved out of, but at the same time, new refugees were developing their English language skills. So it was partially a workforce development program in conjunction with the Refugee Center. But sustaining that is always the challenge. And you don't want any of this to be a one-off.
Mhm.
Mhm.
And Andrea, what about you? What do you find most difficult about creating this two-way street?
Yeah, I mean, I think the word that you're using is, we talk about it often in terms of sustainability, right? What does it mean to just be here, do work? And I think we are similarly a very small team, but I think that the most difficult part of our work is really introducing new forms, I think, to a public, because we're not a traditional museum, and really being like opening up the options and the understanding of what artwork looks like. And it's something I think about all the time. We've been working on a project on the artist Tina Gerard, who is originally from southwestern Louisiana, moved to New York and then to Haiti and came back. And, one of her practice is really expansive for us and has really changed the way we even think about ourselves. I think one of the things we do as museum work is always talk about expertise, right? We're developing, we're building institutions and instruments that draw on our expertise. But I think that the work that we're talking about is rooted in a not knowing, in a really like a learning. What are all of the other tools? I mean, when you're describing some of the artwork that you do, Anna, it's not reading and writing and looking at slides or looking at objects in the way that we think about art history. And I think Tina Gerard's practice has been so revelatory for us because a lot of her practice is about thinking is sweeping and dusting and caring for a home and building a community. A lot of people know Food, the restaurant that opened in Soho, which grew out of Tina's practice of cooking okra and gumbo for all of her artist community friends and kind of perpetually kind of creating a home. And so that's something that we think about all the time in our own practice. We have a physical home where we invite people in, but often that's about hosting. It's a kind of Tina thought a lot, she's often known in terms of pattern and decoration movement, and she paid a lot of attention to what important painters might have thought was decorative, right? Of course, she was also a painter, but she was thinking and recognizing that the things we wear, the things that we fashion our home, the way that we really compose our environment is also a way of signifying who we are and where we come from, and being able to share that with other people. And so, I think a lot of our work is the hard part sometimes is coming outside of our historical practices. As a small team, we're also like, we have to cook, we have to make that meal when everyone comes. We have to, when we're we have a program called the Confluence, where it's non-public work, where we invite artists into conversation for seminar style conversations over the course of a year. But when we invite them, we're not just, setting up the AV equipment for the conversation. We're cooking and cleaning and preparing so that it's that they come into our home and that they feel at place here. And so it's just drawing on a different set of tools. And I think in all of this, one of the things that, Anna, I think you're also saying is it's exhausting, right? Because I think as art workers, we're also doing new forms of work, some of which we do at home. And then I think the recognition that same kind of care that you maybe extend to your family or to your friends, that's the kind of care that we need to bring into the workplace with artists and our communities. And that's hard to sustain all the time.
Yeah, I think it's interesting to watch the changes that are happening in the hospitality industry, which I think are instructional for those of us who are in the museum and cultural business, which is this idea of being so welcoming. It's not always been the first thing on the minds of all the museums in the world, but.
Danny Meyer's book, Setting the Table, I don't know if you've read or listened to it, but everything he says about the hospitality, about the restaurant industry, like that could all apply to museums.
Yeah, same. I'm a big fan of Will Guidara and his unreasonable hospitality, and it's the same sort of thing. It's how do you bring people in, whether they're new to your culture or whether they've lived in your city forever. How do you create that welcoming space? And I think Anna talking about going out and doing outreach at the at the churches and at the cultural centers and things like that is important. But I think so is your point about it has to get baked into the entire mission. And I'd love to hear just sort of about, you've been with Munson for a while, but how have you seen that evolve within your institution from sort of the time you got there to the present day?
Boy, how we approach an exhibition programming really is just a 180, right? Because we did a strategic plan that we launched in 2019, but even before that, we were already doing so much deeper community engagement and reaching out to the city in every corner of the city. So the refugee center used to be right across the street from us. They moved a few blocks downtown. But when they were across the street, it made it really easy. The newcomers just always came right in our front door. That was the easiest part, right? But what we learned, is what they need to do is see themselves here. It's not just about having them feel welcome, but it's about seeing themselves here, whether it is in those smaller exhibitions that we did a portrait exhibition of faces of refugees in our community. We've done 2 different clothing exhibitions, and that's just the foot in the door. But then it's everything that Andrea was saying about then having them feel like it's their home, that it's their place that they can come all the time. That we had a young woman who said, "Oh, this is my museum," right? That makes your heart sing. That she now feels that she has that level of ownership. But I think when we sit down and we're developing programming, getting back to your question, Lacy, I mean, it's one of the foundational programs when we're talking about audience and audience building. So it just has become interlaced into everything that we do.
Mm-hmm. And Andrea, I'd like to go back to the wetlands project that you were talking about earlier, because I think that's something that links these things that to the casual viewer would seem to be so distant. Something that's going on in Iran, something that's going on in Louisiana, and how you bridge that and make it back into that kind of thing where you're seeing yourself in another context.
Yeah, and it's. Alia Farid's work has been truly revelatory for us. We had a we were sort of laughing the other day. She had been telling a story and talking about Gulfies, right? The people she had grown up with in Kuwait. And I started laughing. I said, I'm a Gulfie, right? I mean, different Gulfies, but she's also from Puerto Rico. Her mother's from Puerto Rico. And so this idea that we have these relationships to bodies of water, and how much the kinds of threats and the kinds of cultural relationships there are sites, I've done, there are sites in the world that receive messages in a bottle quite frequently, right? It's because that's where the currents travel. And it's an interesting thing. And one of those places is Lesbos in Mytilene. And of course, this is also a site of where terrific refugee populations have been crossing. And I know a little bit about this just because my family is actually from Lesbos. And so it's an interesting thing, though, to think about, there are these sites in the world and that have been receiving people and in different ways than Utica is, but not that different, right? There's a kind of a custom of reception. New Orleans is one of those places, and there are port cities all over the world that have that kind of pressure of historical assimilation, adaptation, translation, and once you start mining them, you start to see that those kinds of pressure points have resulted in very specific kinds of forms and bodies of knowledge. And so I think one of the things we keep seeing is when we're working with artists is, what you're describing in the case of Alia Farid in Basra is not foreign to us at all. And yet it's been really estranged by our own perception of it, right? I mean, one of the things we have been talking about is how, the Gulf War was the first televised war. It's the language and the visual scape that we associate with Iraq has been kind of predetermined. We know what this environment is because we watched on television, right? We saw the toppling of Saddam Hussein, and yet what I think her practice does for us, it estranges what we have been, the kind of visual information that we've absorbed. So, when we're talking about the wetlands, and the other night she gave a talk, and we're so often look at wetlands from an aerial perspective because we're commonly talking about the disappearance of the wetlands, right? Or, the degradation and the destruction of the wetlands. And so people give you aerial photographs so you can see how much smaller it's become. And Alia's work doesn't do that. She gets really down to the level of the reeds and your people's faces in the dark. And it's such a human space, but it's also very difficult to navigate. And I think that and that's one of the tricks. That's one of the great astonishing facts. And it's why there have been generations of those who are seeking refuge in the wetlands, because people on the outside don't know what's on the inside. And so it's those who know how to navigate the inside that can survive there. That's a history that is our own history in Louisiana. It is where the enslaved went for protection, because those who lived in the city of New Orleans and slaveholders who lived across Louisiana didn't go into the wetlands because they know they wouldn't come out. And it's the very reason why, the Iraqi regime sought to do so much destruction and to destroy the date forests and the wetlands, was because they couldn't control it. And so I think these kinds of really, like, it comes down to really baseline patterns that you start to see, right? What kinds of lands can we control, and what does conquest look like, and what are those kinds of in Alia's work, it often has to do with water, the vessels that people pass to others. It's a very common custom. And I think these are, to go, you would use the word art being the universal language, but there are a lot of language forms and physical forms, objects that hold these kinds of signifying gestures, and they are frankly transcultural. I mean, they have very specific information that we can learn about from one another, but it's not that difficult to find that that tool in one's own community that functions in that same way. Oh, we use this for this. And it wasn't long ago that I wrote a little bit about Alia's first trip, and she always uses the expression, and I just noticed that it kept coming up. How do you call that? Was that kind of language, and I loved that framework, because I realized that every time she said that, it was both a curiosity about where we are, but also embedded in that is the recognition that we call it something else, right? So let's find that space where I can understand what it is that you call that, and translate it. All of this is an act of translation. And I think to your question before about it, like representation versus exchange, I think is maybe a difference between like maybe fluency in something and translation, which is like necessarily riddled with error and confusion and double entendre and all of those things. And that's where, it's actually such a joyful space of like, oh, this thing we thought was so hard or scary is actually the most fruitful. It's the generative space where like, oh, it has 5 more meanings than the one that we thought it had,
Yeah, I want to come back to that idea of joy, but go ahead, Anna.
No, I was just going to say the same thing, Lacy. I mean, I love that, talking about that as the joyful space, because one of the things we talked about when we met a couple of weeks ago was, at least here at Munson, we spend a lot of work, whether, making it so that it can just simply be for the community to feel welcome and have a joyful experience, right? It doesn't have to be an ELL. We do free art classes for kids in the community, right? And so just so that they come and have a joyful experience. And that is that introduction that again gets back to laying that foundation. And Andrea, I love you talking about water, because when you think about water as a basic human necessity, right, as well then is all of thinking about ritual and as a theme, right, is just so universal. But a joyful experience, if that's what we accomplish, that can just be enough.
Yeah, and I think because we had talked when we spoke a few weeks ago, we had talked about this kind of eternal debate of is art a necessity or is it a luxury? And I think when you get joy into the mix there, it does tip the scales a little bit. But I'd like to talk a little bit more about that notion of how do you kind of uplift the role of art when people are struggling for basic necessities. They're struggling for a place to live. They're struggling for food to feed themselves or their children. They're looking for jobs. How do you make the case that art is essential? And I think we're going to come back around to joy, but I would like to go ahead and explore that a bit. Anna?
I think that, I mentioned earlier about preserving culture. And when you are destroying culture, you're destroying a people, right? And that thinking about art as using art as essential, I mean, right? We all express ourselves, and Andrea said it perfectly, and everything that we do is an expression of art. It defines us as humans, and preserving those individual cultures and making that cultural connection is essential to helping people not only feel welcomed, but have them feel valued. And I think that that's a really important aspect of all of these programs that our organizations are doing.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, and it demonstrates empathy too, which I think is also important.
Yeah. I mean, I think New Orleans is actually a really an important illustrative site for this, right? There have been many times where there is very little left of, I think in the days following Katrina, but I mean, really the life of New Orleans, the kind of in the face of difficulty, this community has made art. It has made music, it has danced in the streets. It is a responsive relationship to challenge. And I think right there, this is a necessity. It's clear that people need this as a tool for sustainability, to survive conditions of life which are not getting easier. But I think it's, you use the word, Anna, ritual, and we've talked a little bit about it, but I'm someone who kind of grew up on 60s and 70s art, thought a lot about process. But to go back to the art of Tina Gerard, one of the things I think I've been realizing lately and really thinking a lot about is what is that difference between process work and ritual? And I think one of the differences is the function of art, in not just in the art construction, but its resonance in something larger, in a kind of operational way of living, right? So when we think about, there can be performance work, and that performance work is ritual. And I think all performance work really is ritual, whether we know that or not about it. Maybe when we go back and we look at the histories of late 20th century art, and think about some of this work that we think about as process or procedural, what is its function for our understanding and for our functioning in the world, and something larger, systems outside of what we might regularly define as art. And I think it is those rituals that it's where meaning enters in, right? It does this and it means this. And I think that's a space that I'm really curious about. And I think that's also when we come back to communities that are drawing from different wells of context, right? Migrating from different environments, this is what it does, or this is what it looks like, and that's what it means. And we construct meaning from all the experiences we've had before. So we do it really differently from one another, depending on where we've been. And I think that goes back to Anna, so why I think your work is so interesting, where you're, really pushing against knowledge that's held in different communities and recognizing that you might be arriving at different meanings, or there's a lot of that's the same, that you're holding together out of maybe a line and how it functions.
Yeah, I'm curious, Anna, how when you do collect that kind of information, how do you then integrate it into the collection? How does it kind of get preserved? To go back to the woman who talked about her experience of spiders as medicinal in response to Louise Bourgeois sculpture. How does that then get integrated into the institution?
On a really practical level, it gets incorporated into the database, so that it is one level of the labels that we can do in the galleries. But we've also used a lot of video recordings so that in exhibitions, we can have those community voices represented. I mean, everything from doing a video in a gallery to, QR code where then you can dial in and hear the community voices. Those actually, I think, have been some of the most successful, because that they have a really high participation rate as far as the data that we can gather. And so they're preserved both audio and written. Do they get used all the time? Well, honestly, of course not. But they are there, and they are preserved. And when we have done some special programs. We did one called Tours and Translations, where we invited different community members to come in and give a tour of a special exhibition. And they worked with the education department, but it was their tour. So it's almost like they were being a docent, but they represented a culture from our community. And so then that they could invite their friends and neighbors in and hear their own perspective. So a lot of different layers, and haven't found maybe the perfect solution, but we do, again, keep and document all of that. So
I think there's really something super exciting about what is the practically we put it in the database, but I think it's these really kind of pedestrian tools that we all use, and how they become real sites of learning, right? And we can go back to them. And I think, we had, in our last conversation, we spoke a little bit about kind of wall labels, right? We talk a lot about wall labels. When are they in translation? What languages are we translating them into? Are we translating them only on an occasion where this particular exhibition contends with issues that we determine are institutionally determined are relevant for a particular community versus all communities? And I think these are really interesting questions. But one of I always think about this moment where we at Rivers have the opportunity, we present with a number of long form presenting partners. And one of our long form presenting partners is the California African American Museum in Los Angeles. And I have we've been working on these extensive wall labels for a project that we did with the artist Troy Montez Michi, and it was really foregrounding borderland culture, Mexican American borderland culture, and drew from so many histories and literary histories, Chicano literature, and And of course, the work itself is radically abstract in many ways. And he has been mining the history of the zoot suit. And so in all this work, most visitors who came in encountered a very, a radically contemporary formal exhibition. But the wall labels were not about the form. They were about all of these histories and points of historical reference. So there was this kind of relationship between history and contemporaneity that was playing out across the gallery. But importantly for me, when we had written one of the wall labels, we had described the Watts riots. And it was in one of our earliest conversations that a teammate from CAM, California African American Museum, said, we don't, and kind of laughed at, we don't call it that here. And she said, it's the Watts Rebellion. And it was, that kind of local knowledge where you're like, oh yes. And now that changes everything about what we had written there. And, did that get incorporated into the traveling of the show? Absolutely. And then from there on, every site that it visited had this kind of knowledge that is from the community itself. Like, no, that is not what that history is. Let me tell you, let me reframe that whole history. And so, it kind of gets assimilated into the knowledge that we bring with us and into the practice.
That's so important. We have a group here, African American Community Partners, which is a group from the BIPOC community in Utica. And when we are doing exhibitions, for a couple of years ago, we did an exhibition of Alan Rohan Crite. And everything about that exhibition, from what the title of the exhibition, what artworks were chosen, and how they were interpreted, all went through. It's actually how we formed that group, all went through because we would have definitely made mistakes and made mistakes in interpretation. And we as an organization learned so much. They were formed for that exhibition in 2018 or 2019. We have been meeting almost monthly ever since. It's one of the most valuable monthly conversations that we have.
But also so wonderful that it's not specific to a particular project. It's just
not anymore, right?
I think that goes back, Lacy, to your question about, how is this all the time work, and how does this become kind of the structure of the institution, that it's not a one-off event. It's like this kind of perpetual knowledge that now gets held in the body.
It's interesting. In this group, we asked them if they wanted to branch out and do other things, if they wanted to help us on our DEIA committee, and they want to work only on museum and art related projects. And so we stuck with that. And it has been, I can't tell you, invaluable. It has truly been invaluable.
I'm curious, and this is a question for either of you or both of you. If you can remember a sort of aha moment between an audience and an interpretation or an artwork. So like in Utica, maybe somebody who goes generations back in Utica, interacting with these groups of people who come in more recently, where there's been this kind of like illumination of oh, something that I've taken for granted or I've assumed something about for a long time, I see it in a new way. But you as well, Andrea, is there something you can point to that really kind of illustrates that?
But when go ahead, Andrea.
Well, mine is the first thing that comes to my mind is not really a direct answer to your question, but it's a kind of close cousin to it, which is we have been working with the artist Helen Kemick, who's from New York from London for several years now, and we will present her first North American commission here in New Orleans next month. But when Helen first came here, she came with this real sensitivity and sensibility that she's an outsider. She's lived in the UK her whole life, spent most of her practice has taken place either within the United Kingdom or, adjacent in Europe, really didn't know America at all. And for us, that was this like amazing opportunity to have her come to understand America through the Amistad Research Center archive. Like, this is the America that I'd like to introduce you to as your first date. But she commented not very many weeks into her residency here, that she was actually having a very unexpected experience here, which was to say that she expected to come here and be a total foreigner. And what she actually experienced was, Helen is of African descent and very tall. So when she is in spaces, for the average woman, she's taller than you are. And she said never in her life had she been invisible. She had always been this, everyone could always see her. She always knew she was being looked at her whole life experience. And being in New Orleans, she receded into the background, and that many people expected, or who encountered her, thought she was from here. Something about the way she moved through space, something about, and it was the most estranging experience for her to be in some place that was totally not her own, and to feel more a sense of belonging than she had ever been accustomed to growing up in her home country. And I think that kind of information is something that I think it's not about a public encountering a work and an interpretation, but I think it is about a framework that hopefully some of our work that we do with artists and then we share with a public gets exchanged, is that the moment when you expect to be the outsider can be inverted into a real kind of deep sense of insider information and knowledge from shared experience, or shared perception, or shared subjectivity. And the quite the opposite can also be true, right? You might expect to belong in a space and find yourself feeling quite excluded from the experience. So there's a lot in there. I feel like I'm still unpacking about what that means. But for me, that stays with me right now as we approach sort of the sharing of that exhibition with the public, of like, what does it mean to be from outside versus inside, and this in a place that like really prides itself on, are you a local? Oh yeah, where did you go to school? Like how many generations can you prove that kind of thing? And so to feel that welcomingness in our community was really something special.
For me, Lacy, the story that pops to mind is this is probably about at least 5 years ago now, but when we had this program, Shared Tradition, where people who were taking English language learning classes at the Refugee Center once a week did a class here, and they were working with a temporary exhibition, a loan exhibition that we had on view that was predominantly 18th century Western European art. And so you had refugees, a pretty diverse group of refugees working with that collection. And one of the things they did was each chose an artwork to talk about publicly, to give a public presentation at the conclusion of the 6-week program that they were in. And so I went upstairs so that I could hear some of the gallery talks, the mini gallery talks the students were giving. And I went up as there was a gentleman named Kunsola, who is a Buddhist monk, a refugee who resettled here in Utica. And he was talking about an 18th century painting of Adam naming the animals. So something totally not from his religious culture. And he was talking about it. He was interpreting the artwork. And he concluded by saying, I mean, here you have, the lion and the lamb laying down together. And what if we could all be that way? I mean, what if, as a world, we could act as you see and can interpret this work of art? And it was the anniversary of 9/11, the morning of 9/11, like 9:30 in the morning that he was doing this. And to me, and the group that he was speaking to was diverse from, just completely diverse, for the refugees, the museum staff, everyone. And it was just, to me, the epitome of what one would ideally want out of all of this experience. Like this shared human experience, this bonding moment, this art at the center of it, the universal human emotion of not just the artwork, but of uniting all of us and in the commonality and letting all of the differences slip aside. It was just perfect. I get goosebumps. I'm so corny. I get goosebumps now just thinking about it.
I have chills when you tell that story. So, and it's great as I know we're coming to the end of our hour together, and it's a great way to end to wrap up the conversation, because I think what we're sort of all coming towards is that we live in a precarious world, and that the precarity is only going to increase, and that rather than being afraid of it, that we should look to it for opportunities in which to find new ways to connect with each other and support each other, and that as we are here in cultural institutions, we have a unique role to play in facilitating these kinds of interactions that will bring us joy and bring us together and give us new ways of sustaining and coping with our lives in the future. And we've got about 5 more minutes left. So do either of you want to make any final last observations?
I'll only say, when Anna was talking just now, and you were talking, part of that story is also about the kind of knowledge that we get from non-human subjects, right? This is also a story about animals, and one of the things that came up recently, and to go back to Alia, because we've been talking quite a bit about her in her research in the Amistad Research Center, she found this was last spring, she found a document that was tracing all of the animals that had gone missing, right? From the kind of pollutants from chemical industry, all along what we call Cancer Alley in Louisiana, from the petroleum industry. And it was a list made by this extraordinary woman that most people during her lifetime knew just as like a shop worker in town, but she was actually also a shop worker and radical environmentalist before people were doing that sort of thing, and certainly in her community. But she was documenting all of the changes she was seeing in these very slow ways, and it was mostly a list of animals. This cow is missing, this is missing, and it was going through all of this. And the other night when we closed a talk with Alia, which she actually presented at the end, was not visual at all. It was actually just buffalo calls. And we turned out all of the lights, and you could just hear the sounds of a young boy that she had come to know over the years, who's not that young anymore. She's been spending so much time there that she's watched him grow into a teenager, but calling back and forth with the buffalo. And I think I mention this just because we talk a lot about human experience, but I think one of the things that we see coming up in a lot of artist practices, and that we are learning from a lot, is paying attention to non-human living world around us, and that can also be a kind of common ground of understanding, because paying attention to there's a lot of knowledge outside of our heads that we can draw in. And I think that as we become more attuned to environmental crises and climate change, a lot to learn from that kind of witnessing.
I think, all of this conversation just reminds me again and again that people like to think of museums as neutral spaces, and we are not neutral spaces. We can provide an open, safe platform for conversation, for discussion, for calls to action. And in this changing world, it's a really important role for all of us.
Yeah. Well, I thank you both for being here today, and everyone who tuned in. And I also want to thank the Henry Luce Foundation for setting up this series of conversations, and to the New York Historical Society for hosting us. So thanks, everyone, and enjoy your weekend.
Thank you. Thanks, Lisa. Bye-bye.